have a computer?
What you need, son, is a up the hooter. Computer's gonna cost me a leg and an arm.
Not the Toshiba pack. Stay calm.
Cost me a bomb. Things you need later.
They're all thrown in. Keep your shirt on, Peter.
What happens next year when it's out of date?
No chance, Dad. This is MSX, mate.
All that's true. I'm the Queen of Sheba.
And say hello, Tosh, to a new Toshiba.
Today we're going to talk about the MSX computer. Why wasn't it big in the UK? Why did it kind of get trounced by the establishment such as the Commodore 64 and the Sinclair Spectrum? Because the idea behind the MSX was very, very good. Now, the MSX system was devised by a Microsoft employee, Kazuhiko Niki, who first thought of the idea to basically bring into line all of the disparate machines that were out there. So basically everybody had a set standard. Now, the MSX logo, as you can see behind us, there's some debate on the naming of that, because he said it was machines with software exchange, but prior to that he said he based it on the MX missile, so nobody's really sure, to be honest. And the whole MSX system was based on a Spectra Video SV328, and that was the original machine it was all based around. Z80 processor, a Texas Instruments graphics chip, and Microsoft Basic, a version of Microsoft Basic which was basically written for these machines. So the whole idea was that everything was interchangeable and everything was able, or every machine was able to run everybody else's software, and that was not a bad idea. It was kind of where the PC was. So why did he do it? Why did he come up with this idea? Well, the idea came from the fact that Europe was the biggest market for gaming computers in the world, basically, and he kind of thought that it would be a nice idea to standardize everything, and it was almost bringing everything into line as well. What I mean about bringing everything into line, as you can see by the logo, it was bringing everything into line in a standard, a Microsoft standard, which was a good idea from the point of view of Microsoft and a good idea from the point of view of software developers, but was it really a good idea from the point of view of computer and hardware developers? Because it's kind of a step back. But that's another argument for a different day. But the initial idea to have everybody being able to run the same software and the same games and so on wasn't a bad one. And as ideas go, it's where we are now with the IBM PC, and it's compatible. So you can kind of argue that that's the way the home computer side should have went, but it inevitably didn't, and it inevitably didn't because there were few issues with the way this machine accessed its video RAM, and it was very slow. And there were also some early compatibility issues between early machines, and a lot of the early adopters of the MSX specification, it wasn't correct, it wasn't the finalized version. So you had some versions of MSX compatible in brackets machines that weren't really MSX compatible, and one of those was actually the Spectra Video machines, and it was quite a bit of a shame because, you know, they looked good, and it was one of the first MSX machines I actually ever saw, and they looked interesting enough for people to buy, especially the one with the white case chiclet keyboard and the little joystick on the right hand side, which was quite novel at the time. So why did it fail? Well, it predominantly failed because of these and the Commodore 64, because they were already established, especially in the UK. The MSX was a big deal in Japan. It was very, very well received in places like Brazil, and certain parts of Europe as well adopted the MSX, but as a whole the UK and the US didn't get any traction, which was kind of odd because Microsoft being a big US company and their idea of a system that was Universal didn't get traction was probably, it was more than a little bit of a blow to them. Now, were the machines any good? Technically, they were. They were on a par at least with machines like the Commodore 64, but they weren't any better. They were based on the Z80 processor. They had 64K of memory. They were no more able to chuck larger graphics around the screen than any other machine that was out there. And they were 8-bit as well. They were kind of launched at a time where people were now considering going to 16-bit machines. So it was possibly too late, and I think that was the biggest problem. They were a little bit too late. The only machine that seemed to gain ground in the UK was the Toshiba, the HX10. It is probably the only machine that you will see quite often in the UK because it wasn't overpriced, it was well built, and it was adopted reasonably well, and because it gained a little bit of traction because of that. But as a whole, the rest of the MSX range were very rarely seen. The Canon V range were fairly well received in other countries. They sold quite well in France, but they didn't sell very well in a lot of places. In Japan, though, the MSX machine was a hit. It was widely adopted. There were dozens of MSX machines from Canon, Toshiba, Philips, and so on, Sanyo, Sony, which were around on the marketplace. And if you look carefully, you can still find a lot of these machines coming up for sale now and again. So they did last very, very well, and they were generally quite well built. So one of the machines we're going to look at is the Toshiba, and we're going to take a look at it and have a look at exactly what it was all about. Okay, so here's a Toshiba HX10. It's a 64K MSX computer, and the first thing you notice, it's flat. It's very flat. I mean, there's no angle on the keyboard itself. The whole machine is like one flat block, but the actual machine itself is incredibly well built. The case is solid. The keys actually feel really nice. The only problem is there's very little step to the keys on here. It's almost like the Sinclair Spectrum keyboard, where it's flat, although it's much better quality and it feels quite nice. The other thing you'll notice is the MSX logo, which all of the MSX compatible machines had, and a cartridge slot, because predominantly the software was really designed to run off cartridges. The games, etc., were almost certainly designed to be cartridge based. So other than that, it's kind of a greyish slab. It's not a kind of a nasty looking machine. It's quite presentable. It's quite nice looking, in fact. But yeah, that didn't look like that put a lot of effort in its form, because it's very functional, this machine. It is incredibly functional, which is why I think they lasted so long and why they're still available now, especially in a country where, like the UK, where they weren't particularly popular. On the side you just have a power switch. That's all there is on this side, and on the rear you've got your expansion bus, video, audio, RF and cassette. So there's not a massive range of expansion on this machine at all. The video is composite style. RF, again, is not a bad picture on this one, to be honest. It's very stable and very, very clean. And the cassette is one of its proprietary DIN leads, which is fine, because a lot of machines use them, including the Dragon machines, etc. Very similar kind of form factor. On the other side you have two joystick ports, standard joystick ports, and a printer interface, which is very proprietary. It uses their own cable set, etc. But you know, at least it had one. A lot of home computers at the time didn't have a form of outlet for a printer, let alone a disk drive or anything else. So let's go over the specifications of this machine. It's the UK HX10 here, which was about £275 when launched in 1983. It has 64K of memory, and it takes an MSX cartridge only. Okay, so the video was a TMS 9918A, which is a Texas Instruments chip, and the chipset was its own proprietary chipset related to the MSX only. The machine was also Z80 based, and it was no faster and no more powerful than most of the Z80 based machines that were out there. And obviously it was manufactured by Toshiba, and this is the one that most of the people in the UK know about. So the machine wasn't massively over-spec'd. The 3.6 megahertz Z80 was slightly quicker than what you had in the Spectrum, but not by a lot. But it was hamstrung by the way it accessed its video RAM, which was a lot slower. And that's where a lot of software companies had problems with these machines, because of the way it accessed its video RAM, the games appeared to be a lot more sluggish at times, and they had to work a lot harder to get them more playable or be on a par with maybe a 64 or a ZX Spectrum. Now, one thing I really did think was good about the MSX when I first saw it was I liked the way it was laid out, I liked the way it was built, I liked the build quality behind it, and I also liked the idea of a machine that was compatible with others, which meant that we could start having software written across the board, which was to me was a great idea. Which the premise behind the MSX was a good one, and I think that it should have worked. It should have worked in the UK. It should have worked in the USA. It was no reason why it didn't work, because the PC has proven that something like this should have worked. We were kind of in our die-hard state of Commodore machines, Sinclair machines, and that was the biggest thing. And then Amstrad came along and started taking market share from the MSX in Europe and Spain and so on. So they were kind of on a little bit of a hiding to nothing to try and get a foothold, especially in the UK and parts of Europe. And in the USA, no, there was no way they were going to get a foothold, especially with the games consoles, which was the biggest market at the time, followed by the PC. I mean, even Amiga and the Atari ST couldn't really get that much of a foothold in the USA because of games consoles and the IBM PC. So it had an uphill struggle, which I think was a shame, because the concept was brilliant. Now, some of the early machines which I'm going to show you, which here we have the Spectra Video, the original Spectra Video machine. It's different, it looks different, it looks funky, it's eye-catching, it's more of a toy in its appearance. And that was the very first machine I actually saw. And I didn't think that machine itself would have gotten anywhere, because it was too kind of toy-like. It was something you would have thought was brought out by Mattel. And then the second machine was the Sony Hitbit, followed by this Toshiba machine here. And this is the one which I kind of thought would have gained traction, because it looked more professional, looked more usable, looked more businesslike. And it did. It was a mild hit in the UK. They sold well and well enough, and there was quite a range of software out if you went into any computer shop for them. But ultimately, the Spectrum, the Commodore 64 and the Amstrad are the ones that prevailed until the 16-bit machines came out only a short time after this one got any kind of foothold. So let's have a look at how the MSX looks when you turn it on and how it performs. So the MSX, when you turn it on, you're greeted with a kind of a bluish screen. It's not quite as blue as you see on video, but it's a nice sort of mid-blue to slightly purple screen. And you've got MSX Basic version 1.0, and it was copyright Microsoft. It's a 64K machine, but it's almost like the Commodore in a way. You only get the 64, where you only get 28K free, and that's very much the same as this MSX here. It uses a lot of memory for its system as such, so you don't get a huge chunk of memory free for basic. And think again, when you had machines such as the Commodore Plus 4, which had virtually its entire chunk of memory free for use, it seemed a bit, well, is it really supposed to be a 64K machine? But it's banked. And obviously when you having a cartridge system on this as well, which uses 16K chunks, it's going to start dropping the usable memory for things like basic. But 28K is still a healthy chunk of memory to play around with, considering a BBC Micro only had 32K to start off with. Now, the keyboard on this is still fine. The keyboard actually is quite nice. It's got quite a nice action to it. It isn't really spongy, although it's not really key switched or micro switched. It's eminently better than a lot of the machines that are out there and were out there at the time. And it works really well, but this one really needs to strip down, to be honest, because it has literally been locked up in an attic for decades. Now the Toshiba MSX, the original MSX machines, it wasn't the end of them, because in countries such as Japan they launched an MSX2, which was based around the same CPU and roughly the same specifications as the original MSX, but they had a minimum of 64K RAM. They were also very much improved in the way that the cartridges were accessed, and they had slightly more colors, slightly better resolution, as in usable resolution, but as a whole they were very, very much just an improved standard MSX, in very similar in the way you got a ZX Spectrum Plus and a Plus 128. And again, they gained a lot of traction in the Japanese markets, etc., but not so much in Europe. I mean, they're very hard to find in Europe in a lot of countries, and especially in the USA as well. They are very, very hard to come by, but they did soldier on for quite a while, and there was a lot of software produced for the MSX range, not so much for the MSX2. But even then, that wasn't the end of the story, because Kazuhiko Nishi decided that he was going to revive the MSX in 2001 on a single chip computer as well. So he's always trying to revive the MSX brand. I think it was something that was quite close to his heart. And then in 2008 they tried to revive it again as a learning machine called the GR8-bit, and again, it was to revive the MSX platform in a way, using very similar premise to the original MSX computers. But even today, the MSX has a following, and there are sites such as the MSX Resource Center, which have downloads and technical specifications. They have articles and a forum, all based around the MSX. And from what I can see, it's a much used forum for these machines, and one, if you have an MSX or interested in it, go and visit it, have a look around their site, and then see what the MSX did and can do. Now, the MSX computer range was a very good attempt at standardizing a very fragmented market, and it is a bit of a shame it didn't work, but all of the MSX machines predominantly ran on Z80 CPUs. The last MSX, the MSX3, used a completely different processor, but the premise was the same, for them all to be compatible with each other. And I think it was a worthy project, but unfortunately, due to market conditions and people's locale and country where they have specific machines which are already dominating the market, it didn't quite make it, which is a shame, because technically they were on par with most things, and build quality wise they were above most things. And I'm guessing that if they come out at the start of the 8-bit revolution, this is where we would be today, with MSX compatible hardware all the way through the range, because it would have gained much more of a foothold. But in saying that, it's a great piece of hardware to have, and it's a great addition to your collection if you're into these, or as your own personal 8-bit machine if it's your route that you want to go down with, because there's still plenty of software available for these machines. And there's also people producing new hardware for these machines, which I'm going to cover in the next video. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this quick look into the MSX and why it didn't gain the traction it should have, but ultimately I think it should have done better. And I hope you'd like to subscribe to this channel, because there's more content coming. Okay, so thank you for your time.